Hey guys, tonight we step into a world thick with the smell of smoke, flour dust and baking bread, where the humble loaf you munch on without a second thought was once a source of fear, control and even rebellion. Imagine trudging through narrow cobblestone streets, the air heavy with the scent of burning wood and rising dough, knowing that the oven you tend might decide your fate. The heat isn't just from the fire, it's from laws, from rulers, from a kingdom obsessed with controlling what you bake. You probably won't survive this story without at least craving a sandwich, but hey, that's just part of the deal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I want to know where in the world this bread story is reaching you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in a medieval bakery, not one of those Instagrammable artisan spots with cute signs and rustic bread baskets, but a gritty, smoky workspace where sweat, soot and heat are your daily companions. The oven is a monstrous stone-built beast, breathing fire and threatening to scorch not just your bread but your livelihood. Its mouth glows red as you shove in your dough, hoping it will rise just right and not turn into something closer to a brick. In medieval towns, bread was more than just a food staple. It was life itself. The smell of fresh bread was as familiar as the dawn, a daily ritual that shaped the rhythm of the streets. You'd hear the chatter of bakers shouting prices, see housewives clutching their coins tightly, and smell the mix of wood smoke and yeast as the oven worked its magic. The air was thick, and so was the pressure. You might think it was simple back then. Just bake some bread and sell it, right? Wrong. Every loaf carried weight beyond the calories. Bread symbolized power and survival. Kings and lords knew this all too well, and they were determined to keep a tight grip on what was baked, how it was baked, and for how much. You wouldn't just be making food, you'd be making trouble if you stepped out of line. Historians still argue whether the tight control of bread was primarily about public health, economic stability, or sheer royal greed. But what's clear is that bakers were caught in a web of expectations and regulations that could crush even the best of them. Imagine working your fingers to the bone, kneading dough before sunrise, and then facing punishments for a loaf too heavy or too light, or worse, selling it for a penny too much. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers believed that talking to their dough or whispering sweet nothings could coax it into rising better. Yeast was a bit of a mystery, sometimes seen as magical or even spiritual, rather than just a fungus doing its job. This blend of hard work and superstition made the baker's life a strange mix of science and folklore. So, as you stand there, feeling the heat and hearing the crackle of the fire, remember, medieval baking was a high-stakes game, and you were the player who might just lose everything over a loaf. The smell of bread was everywhere, but so was the fear lurking behind it. This is just the beginning of why medieval bakers were so afraid of bread laws. You trudge deeper into the heart of the medieval world, where bread isn't just something you eat. It's something you live by, breathe in, and sometimes fear. You probably think of bread as simple. Flour, water, a pinch of salt, maybe some yeast, right? But in medieval times, bread was a symbol of life itself, the essence of survival, and a reflection of the society around you. To understand why bakers feared bread laws so much, you have to grasp just how important bread was beyond the kitchen. Bread was life's currency, quite literally. If you were poor, your daily existence hinged on the crust of a loaf. Nobles might feast on rich white bread made from finely sifted wheat, while peasants made do with coarser, darker loaves from rye or barley. The type of bread you ate shouted your place in the social order, louder than any fancy hat or shiny shoes. Think of it as the original social media status symbol, except way more edible. You inhale the smoky air mixed with the sharp tang of fermenting dough, and realise that bread was also a political tool. Kings and rulers understood this deeply. Control the bread, and you control the people. When grain was scarce, bread prices soared, and famine whispered through the streets like an unwelcome ghost. Because bread was so central to life, any disruption could cause panic, riots, and outright rebellion. In fact, historians still argue whether some early revolts were sparked more by hunger or by the symbolism of bread shortages. It's a debate that dough experts and historians knead over even today. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some medieval cities, bakers were not just bakers. they were also tax collectors, and oddly enough, informal bankers. Since bread was so valuable, bakers often held payments or debts in the form of bread or grain, acting as a strange kind of medieval credit system. Imagine going to your local bakery not just for a loaf, but to settle a debt with a handful of flour or a few loaves stashed away for hard times. The sacred role of bread also meant it played a starring part in religious rituals. The Eucharist, the Holy Communion bread, was seen as the literal body of Christ, a spiritual sustenance that added weight to the secular importance of everyday loaves. Bread wasn't just physical nourishment, it was spiritual, social, and political nourishment all rolled into one. You might find it surprising that bread also had medicinal uses. Yes, really. Some medieval healers prescribed stale bread to treat wounds or digestive problems. The crust's tough texture was thought to scrub away impurities, and bread soaked in wine was sometimes a go-to remedy for fevers. It's hard not to wonder if these remedies made the patient feel better, or just gave them something to gnaw on while waiting for actual medicine. So, as you look around the busy market square, where bakers call out their wares and customers haggle over prices, remember that every loaf is layered with meaning. It's more than just food. It's your place in the world, your survival, your religion, and your ruler's power all rolled into a crusty package. No wonder bakers lived in fear of the laws that controlled their craft. They weren't just baking bread, they were baking fate. You're still wandering those medieval streets, feeling the rhythm of daily life pulse around you. But now your eyes catch on something darker, something that underpins every loaf that passes through those ovens, the crown's iron grip, the bread laws. These laws weren't just suggestions or polite reminders, they were ironclad rules enforced with an almost obsessive zeal, designed to control what you baked, how you baked it, and at what price you dared to sell it. And if you think that sounds like an overbearing landlord demanding rent, you're only half right. From the 13th century onward, kings and local lords began passing what we now call bread laws, to maintain order and keep the peace. They feared what would happen if bread prices skyrocketed, or if bakers sold loaves that didn't meet strict standards. You have to imagine a society where bread was such a critical part of the diet that a loaf's size and weight could mean the difference between life and death for many. So, naturally, the crown wanted to make sure bakers didn't exploit the hungry masses. You trudge past a grim sign posted outside a bakery, the assize of bread and ale, a law that reads like a medieval recipe for control. This law dictated everything. The price of a loaf depending on the current price of wheat, the weight it must have, and the penalty for bakers who dared to cheat. You can almost hear the ruler's voice in every line saying, "You will bake this much bread, weigh it this heavy, and sell it at this price, or else." The punishments could be harsh: fines, public humiliation, or even confiscation of the baker's tools and oven. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely about protecting consumers or just a convenient way for rulers to tighten their grip on the economy and prevent unrest. Some scholars believe the laws helped stabilize the market and avoid famine-induced chaos, while others see them as an early form of state micromanagement that crushed small bakers' freedom. Either way, for bakers, these laws were a constant source of anxiety. One wrong loaf could lead to ruin. Now here's a quirky tidbit that might surprise you. Bakers weren't always the villains in this story. In some cases, bakers acted as enforcers of the bread laws, reporting on their competitors or neighbours to town officials. Imagine the tension brewing in those close-knit communities, where a neighbour's too light loaf could mean your own punishment. The smell of freshly baked bread might have been sweet, but the air was thick with suspicion. You step inside a bakery, where the Bakers' Guild meets in a smoky, cramped room. The guild wasn't just about perfecting the art of baking, it was a way to police its own members, enforcing the crown's rules from within. Guilds set strict standards for what counted as acceptable bread, controlling who could bake, how much flour they could use, and even who they could sell to. It was a bit like having a union, but one that made sure you followed all the rules perfectly, or else. The guild's power was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it protected bakers from outside competition and gave them a voice in the city council. On the other, it restricted innovation and freedom, forcing bakers to conform to rigid expectations. Guilds often had spies and informants among their ranks, making the bakery feel less like a place of creativity and more like a courtroom under constant surveillance. You lean against the wooden counter and smell the yeasty warmth filling the air. Bread wasn't just a daily necessity, it was a political battleground, a symbol of authority and control. Every loaf you pulled from the oven was a risk, a balancing act between satisfying customers, obeying the law, and avoiding the wrath of your guild or the town officials. One of the biggest challenges was the assize of bread's strict rules on weight and price. If you sold a loaf too heavy or too light, you faced serious consequences. Bakers often had to use tricky scales and measurement tools, but these devices weren't always accurate or easy to use, especially when you're rushing to meet demand before the oven cooled. You might be thinking, how hard can it be to weigh a loaf? But remember, a few ounces too much could mean jail time or worse. Now for a fringe tidbit, some bakers in England reportedly used crocodile dung in their ovens, not as an ingredient, but as a form of ancient sunscreen for their hands, protecting their skin from the brutal heat. While historians still argue whether this is a fact or just a myth woven into the lore of baking, it does give you an idea of how brutal life by the oven really was. As you exit the bakery, you notice posters warning bakers of upcoming inspections. Inspectors were ruthless, showing up unannounced to check weights, ingredients, and prices. Failure meant fines or public humiliation in the market square, where the offender might be forced to wear a placard listing their crime for all to see. And just as you think it couldn't get worse, you learn that these laws extended beyond just bread. Ale was regulated too, another staple of medieval life, because rulers worried about both food and drink affecting the populace's health and order. Bread laws weren't isolated. They were part of a larger web of control tying bakers, brewers, millers, and merchants into a system designed to keep the crown in power. So here you are, caught in the fiery heat of the oven and the even hotter grip of law and order. You see how baking bread in medieval times was far from a simple job. It was a dangerous dance with authority, a struggle to survive the weight of expectation and the weight of the loaf itself. You might think you're just making bread, but in reality you're baking history, one crust at a time. You step out of the harsh light of the oven's fire and into the shadowy, often conflicting world of the Baker's Guild, a place where camaraderie and control mix like flour and water in a dough that's tough to knead. This guild wasn't just a social club or a group for swapping recipes. It was a powerful institution that shaped the fate of every baker in town, and you, whether you liked it or not, had to be part of it if you wanted to survive. But was the guild a friend or a foe? Well, historians still argue whether guilds were protective allies or just another form of shackles for bakers. At first glance, joining the guild seemed like a no-brainer. It gave you the right to bake, sell, and make a living, protecting you from outside competition and unlicensed amateurs. The guild set standards, trained apprentices, and even bargained with town officials to keep the price of bread stable. You imagine it as a medieval union, the baker's version of a cooperative, all working together to maintain quality and order. But scratch the surface, and you find a tangled web of strict rules, fierce enforcement, and plenty of suspicion. Membership came with a cost, both literal and figurative. You had to pay fees and follow guild laws that dictated everything from what types of bread you could bake to how many ovens you could own. Guilds also decided who got to enter the baking business, meaning newcomers could be blocked, and only certain families or apprenticeships were allowed to carry on the trade. It was like an exclusive club, where the secret handshake was perfect crumb texture, and the password was assize compliance. Imagine the tension when guilds acted as judges and juries against their own members. If you were caught bending the rules, selling underweight bread, using forbidden ingredients, or charging too much, you didn't just face the town officials, your fellow guild members would come down on you hard. Punishments ranged from fines to public humiliation. There's even evidence of guilds forcing repeat offenders to wear humiliating badges or perform awkward public apologies. The guild wasn't just about baking, it was about policing the craft. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some guilds kept secret handshakes or coded signs. Yes, handshakes, in order to recognise fellow members in crowded markets or during inspections. It sounds like a spy thriller, but it was a real medieval practice, helping bakers identify friends, foes, and informers alike. You can almost picture a baker subtly flashing a secret finger wave over the flour sack as they passed a rival. Guilds also controlled baking technology and recipe secrets. Innovations didn't spread quickly because guild members hoarded knowledge to protect their competitive edge. If you were lucky, you might learn a trick or two during your apprenticeship, but you'd have to keep it under wraps or risk expulsion. This slow diffusion of ideas meant that many bakeries stuck to traditional methods, even if newer techniques might have saved time or reduced mistakes. So much for progress. Innovation sometimes took a back seat to tradition and control. The Guild also functioned as a social safety net. Bakers who fell ill or faced hard times could rely on Guild support, whether financial aid or assistance finding work. So while guilds were strict, they also fostered a sense of community. It's this duality that makes their roles so complex. Protectors and oppressors, supporters and enforcers, friends and judges. You notice how guild meetings often happened in smoky back rooms filled with flour dust and heated debates, where bakers argued over prices, standards and inspections. The Guild was a place where local politics, business and law all collided, shaping not just what bread you baked, but how you lived your life. You can almost hear the grumbles and whispers. Did you hear about old Thomas's underweight loaves? Or, be careful, the inspector's coming next week. The pressure to conform was immense. Guild members were expected to report any violations, even among friends or family. This built an atmosphere thick with distrust, where neighbours could turn into accusers overnight. The Guild was a microcosm of medieval society, tight-knit but wary, cooperative yet competitive. Now, let's sprinkle in a bit of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether guilds ultimately protected small bakers from exploitation or simply replaced one form of oppression with another. Some view guilds as early champions of quality and fair trade, while others see them as monopolies that stifled innovation and freedom. Maybe both are true, depending on where and when you look. Imagine your day, kneading dough under the watchful eyes of the guild's standards, knowing that any slip could mean not just fines but expulsion, a death sentence for your livelihood. You're both a craftsman and a prisoner, bound by invisible chains woven from tradition, law and community expectations. That's the paradox of the Guild. It gave bakers a voice and a shield, but also a leash and a whip. You might feel gratitude for the protection it offered, but resentment for its rigidity. It's a reminder that power is complicated, even in the flour-covered corners of medieval bakeries. As you leave the Guild Hall, the smell of fresh bread greets you again, warm and tempting, but beneath it lingers the weight of laws, expectations, and the constant watchful eyes of your peers. The Guild was your family and your jailer, your protector and your accuser, all rolled into one flour-dusted package. You push open the heavy wooden door of a medieval bakery once more, but this time your focus shifts from the heat of the oven and the Guild's suffocating grip to the raw materials that made the magic happen, the grain. Without grain, no bread. It's that simple. Yet in medieval Europe, controlling grain was a high-stakes game of politics, power and survival, and you're about to see just how tightly the strings were pulled by those in charge. Grain was king, and you were just a pawn trying to knead your way to a decent loaf. The first thing you notice is the massive granaries lining the town's outskirts, built like fortresses to protect the precious wheat, rye, and barley. These stores weren't just for the bakers, they were the kingdom's lifeline during famine, war, or bad harvests. Grain was heavily taxed, regulated, and often hoarded by nobles who understood that controlling the grain supply was controlling the people's stomachs, and by extension their loyalty. Historians still argue whether grain hoarding was primarily a form of economic strategy or outright exploitation. Some scholars suggest nobles stockpiled grain to stabilise prices and ensure reserves during lean years, while others believe it was a tactic to drive up prices and increase their own wealth. Either way, you see how these grain policies directly impacted bakers' abilities to produce bread, and at what cost. You watch as a group of millers grind wheat into flour, their large wooden wheels creaking rhythmically. The miller was an essential figure, often as powerful as the baker, because no bread could be baked without flour. Millers typically worked under contracts with the local lord and were required to give a portion of the grain to their master as payment, a form of feudal rent. This milling toll often left bakers with less flour and higher prices, squeezing their margins tight. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some millers were rumoured to sabotage grain or mix it with chaff to increase weight and their profits, leading to suspiciously coarse or low-quality flour. While it sounds like an early version of food fraud, historians still debate how widespread such practices really were. Was it the exception or the rule? Either way, bakers had to be vigilant. Controlling grain and flour quality was critical because poor flour could ruin an entire batch of bread. wasting precious resources. You imagine the frustration of bakers trying to maintain standards when the very flour they received might vary wildly from one day to the next. This uncertainty made bread laws even more essential, but also more difficult to enforce fairly. Grain prices fluctuated wildly based on harvest success, weather, and political stability. When a bad harvest hit, grain prices would spike, and so would bread prices, often sparking unrest. Bread riots weren't uncommon in medieval towns. The starving masses took to the streets when their staple food became unaffordable. You picture angry crowds, torches, and the terrifying roar of desperation filling the night air. This threat of rebellion was a constant worry for rulers, who used bread laws partly to prevent such chaos. But here's the rub. Regulating bread prices while grain prices fluctuated wildly was like trying to keep a balloon inflated with holes in it. Bakers were caught between obeying the law to keep bread affordable and covering their rising costs or facing punishment. You also note how grain imports and exports played into this complex equation. Some towns and cities relied on imported grain to supplement poor local harvests, but this trade was often taxed heavily or restricted. The control over trade routes and grain supply was a key part of regional power struggles, and you feel how the humble loaf was tied to forces far beyond the bakery walls. Now, a little-known fact. Medieval bakers sometimes kept secret stashes of grain or flour hidden away, a kind of survival insurance against bad harvests or price spikes. This was risky business, because hoarding was illegal and punishable by harsh penalties. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and you imagine the nervous thrill of guarding your hidden flour like treasure. As you watch a baker weighing out flour for dough, you realise that every step from field to oven was fraught with uncertainty, control, and risk. Grain was more than just food. It was a weapon, a currency, and a tool of power that shaped the lives of bakers and the people they fed. The connection between the field and the bakery was a tightrope walk where one misstep could mean ruin. You remember the assize of bread and ale, which tried to link the price of bread directly to the cost of grain. But in practice, this was a near impossible balancing act. The Crown's attempts to regulate prices often backfired, punishing bakers who were trying to survive on shrinking margins and rewarding speculators who hoarded grain for profit. So, standing there amid sacks of grain, hearing the creak of mill wheels and the rustle of flour bags, you get a vivid picture of why medieval bakers were so deeply afraid of bread laws. It wasn't just about ovens and recipes. It was about a delicate, volatile system where the cost of a loaf could change with the wind, the harvest, or the whim of a lord. You pull yourself away from the grain stores and step into the bustling market square, where all the economic and social pressures of medieval life converge in a swirl of noise, smells, and faces. This is where the bread wars truly come alive, where bakers, buyers, officials, and inspectors collide in a dance as complex and fraught as any royal court intrigue. You quickly realise that the market wasn't just a place to buy bread. It was the battleground where bread laws were enforced, challenged, and sometimes outright defied. The market square throbbed with activity. Vendors shouted prices, customers haggled fiercely, and the aroma of fresh bread mingled with the less appetising scents of livestock and open sewers. You can almost feel the tension in the air because here, more than anywhere, bread was a matter of survival and pride. Buying bread wasn't just a simple transaction. It was a statement about your place in society, your trust in the baker, and your ability to feed your family. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval towns often had official bread inspectors or bread reeves stationed in the market. These officials patrolled the stalls, weighing loaves and checking prices against the legal standards set by the assize of bread. If a baker's loaf was too light or too expensive, the inspector could seize the bread, fine the baker, or even close the stall temporarily. It was serious business, and these inspectors had a reputation for being both feared and hated. You overhear a heated exchange between a baker and an inspector, the baker protesting that rising grain prices forced him to increase his prices, while the inspector snarls about protecting the poor from exploitation. You get how this dynamic fueled resentment on both sides. Bakers felt squeezed by laws that didn't account for real-world costs, while inspectors were pressured by town officials to enforce regulations strictly or risk riots. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the punishment for selling underweight bread was to publicly display the offending baker on a pillory, a wooden frame where the baker would stand exposed to jeers. rotten vegetables and the occasional well-aimed chicken feather. You imagine the humiliation of standing there, covered in flour dust and shame, while the crowd vents its frustration. It's like a medieval version of being cancelled, but with more poultry. Markets were also hotspots for innovation and competition. Some bakers tried to skirt the laws by selling secret breads, loaves that looked legal, but were made with cheaper ingredients like bran or fillers hidden inside. Others experimented with shapes or sizes designed to confuse inspectors or customers about the loaf's weight. It's a little like the medieval version of sneaky marketing, except with higher stakes. This constant push and pull created a dynamic environment where bakers had to be as much street smart as skilled in their craft. They had to navigate the market's social currents, manage relationships with inspectors and customers, and figure out how to stay profitable without getting caught. It wasn't just about baking bread. It was about survival, reputation, and sometimes outright cunning. You also notice how social class played into market dynamics. Wealthier customers could afford fine white bread, while poorer folks made do with coarser rye or barley loaves. Some bakers specialised in luxury breads for nobles or wealthy merchants, while others catered to the masses. This stratification extended to the marketplace itself, where different stalls targeted different audiences, each with their own expectations and tolerances for quality and price. Historians still debate how much power bakers actually wielded in these markets. Were they savvy entrepreneurs controlling their own destinies, or were they pawns caught between hungry customers, strict laws, and demanding lords? Probably a bit of both, but it's clear that baking bread in the market was as much a social and political act as an economic one. A little-known fact: in some medieval cities, bakers formed informal alliances or bread cartels to set prices and control supply, effectively limiting competition. These secret agreements were illegal but difficult to prove, creating an underground economy that both authorities and customers suspected but rarely caught. It's like a medieval baker's version of Wall Street, but with more flour and fewer suits. As you watch the market bustle, you see how the tension between law and livelihood, community and competition, plays out every day. The fear bakers had of bread laws wasn't just about punishment. It was about navigating a complex web of relationships and expectations, where one misstep could mean financial ruin or public disgrace. You think back to the baker who keeps a secret flour stash, the guild meetings thick with tension, and the inspectors ready to pounce. It's clear that baking bread in medieval times was a delicate balancing act, with the market serving as the stage for all the drama. And as you breathe in the warm scent of freshly baked bread mixed with the sharp tang of suspicion and fear, you realise that the market square wasn't just a place to buy food. It was a theatre where the everyday struggles of survival, power and law played out in flour-covered hands and crusty loaves. You find yourself wandering toward the town square once more, but this time your gaze settles on a shadowy figure, one you hadn't fully considered until now, the bread inspector, that dreaded enforcer of the assize of bread. These inspectors weren't your average bureaucrats. They were the omnipresent watchdogs of the medieval baking world, the ones who could make or break a baker's livelihood with a quick glance or a tap on the scale. To understand why bakers lived in fear of bread laws, you have to step into the shoes of these inspectors and explore the power they wielded. Bread inspectors, often appointed by the town council or royal officials, had a simple but terrifying job: to ensure every loaf met legal weight, size, and price standards. You imagine them patrolling the markets with their scales in hand, scrutinising every seller's wares with hawk-like intensity. Their presence was a constant reminder that the Crown's laws were not suggestions but mandates backed by real teeth, fines, public shaming, or worse. Here's a mainstream fact. Inspectors had the authority to seize loaves that didn't comply, destroy substandard bread publicly, and levy hefty fines on bakers. Their role was central to maintaining public trust in the quality and fairness of bread, the staple food for most of medieval society. Without these enforcers, the risk of fraud or exploitation could spiral out of control, potentially sparking food shortages or social unrest. But the relationship between bakers and inspectors was complicated. Bakers often resented the inspectors, viewing them as agents of oppression rather than protectors of fairness. These officials were sometimes accused of being corrupt, taking bribes to overlook infractions or favour certain bakers over others. You can almost hear the whispered accusations in the taverns and market stalls. Old Giles let that loaf slide because of a silver coin under the table. This corruption is more than just rumour. Historians still argue about how widespread bribery and favouritism were among inspectors. Some believe inspectors were mostly honest but overburdened, while others suggest a system rife with under-the-table deals. Either way, this uncertainty added a layer of stress for bakers, who never knew if their loaf would be judged fairly. Now, a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood. Some bread inspectors were known to carry a special leather bread bag, decorated with symbols of authority, where they kept their scales and official documents. It was like a medieval inspector's briefcase, but with more flour dust and fewer spreadsheets. There are even stories of inspectors losing their bags during chaotic market days, leading to frantic searches and panicked officials trying to reassert control. The inspectors didn't work alone. In larger towns, they often had assistants or teams who could descend on markets and bakeries unexpectedly. Surprise inspections were common, designed to catch bakers cheating or cutting corners. These raids could happen at any time, even during the middle of a busy baking day, throwing the entire operation into chaos. You watch a scene unfold. A group of inspectors storms into a bakery, scales at the ready, as bakers scramble to hide underweight loaves or questionable ingredients. The tension is palpable, like watching a medieval reality show with higher stakes. The baker's nervous smile hides a deep fear. One misstep could mean fines, loss of license, or public disgrace. One of the more dramatic enforcement methods involved public shaming. Bakers caught cheating might be forced to stand in the town square, wearing a sign detailing their crime, or even subjected to a ritual tasting where townspeople could inspect their bread and call out flaws. It was a humbling spectacle designed to deter others from breaking the rules. The inspectors also kept detailed records of bakers' offences. Repeat offenders were monitored closely, and some were even blacklisted from selling in certain markets. You get the sense that once you were on an inspector's bad side, climbing out of that hole was nearly impossible. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how inspectors balanced fairness with enforcement. Did they genuinely seek to protect consumers, or were they instruments of harsh control wielded to maintain social order at all costs? Some argue that strict enforcement helped prevent famine and unrest, while others see it as a system that crushed small bakers under the weight of regulation. You imagine the inspector's own stress, caught between serving the crown, dealing with bribery temptations, and enforcing rules that made them widely disliked. It wasn't an easy job, but it was a powerful one. Their scales and stamps of approval could determine a baker's fate in a way few others could. So as you stand in the market watching inspectors work, you see how these figures embody the tension at the heart of medieval bread laws, the need to regulate a vital food source to keep peace and fairness, balanced against the harsh realities of enforcement and human nature. You take a deep breath of the warm, yeasty air, feeling the invisible weight of authority pressing down on every loaf, every baker, and every hungry customer. The inspectors might have seemed like villains, but without them, the fragile balance of medieval bread life might have crumbled completely. You've come a long way from the warmth of the oven and the bustle of the market, now stepping into the often overlooked but crucial world of medieval baking equipment, the ovens themselves. These weren't just simple brick boxes, they were complex, expensive and heavily regulated tools of the trade, and you quickly learn that owning and operating an oven was a whole other battlefield in the struggle between bakers and bread laws. At first glance, the medieval oven seemed straightforward. A large clay or brick structure, often dome-shaped, where wood fires were stoked until the walls radiated intense heat. You picture the baker shoveling burning embers inside, then sweeping the ashes away before sliding in the dough. But this simplicity masks an intense investment of time, skill, and money. Building and maintaining an oven was costly, and you couldn't just slap one up wherever you wanted. Here's a mainstream fact. In many medieval towns, ovens were subject to strict regulation. Some towns had communal ovens owned by the lord or the town council, and bakers had to pay to use them. Others allowed private ovens but required bakers to have a license, and unauthorized ovens were illegal, strictly because they could disrupt grain consumption patterns or threaten public safety. Unauthorized ovens could even be destroyed by officials. You begin to understand how owning an oven wasn't just about convenience, but a marker of status and control. Bakers who had private ovens had an advantage in efficiency and profit, but also risked harsher scrutiny from guilds and inspectors. The oven was a tool, but also a liability, a symbol of both power and vulnerability. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval ovens had secret compartments, or traps built into them, designed to catch and prevent thieves or competitors from stealing heat or fuel. Imagine a baker's oven, with a hidden door or an intricate flue system that only the owner knew about. These devices could be a source of local legend or gossip, adding a bit of medieval spycraft flair to the baking process. Operating an oven was a skilled craft. Temperature control was vital but difficult. Bakers had to judge the oven's heat by sight, touch and experience, because there were no thermometers. Too hot and the bread burned, too cool and it wouldn't rise properly. You imagine the tension as bakers balanced the fire's strength with the timing, hoping the loaf would turn out golden and fragrant, not charred or doughy. Fuel was another challenge. Wood was the main source of heat, but it was expensive and often rationed. Some towns limited the amount of wood bakers could use, forcing them to find creative ways to keep ovens hot without wasting fuel. This scarcity added another layer of pressure. Bakers couldn't afford to waste either flour or fuel. Historians still argue whether communal ovens were more efficient or simply a way for lords to control bakers and profits. Communal ovens meant bakers shared a resource, which could reduce costs but also led to conflicts over scheduling and cleanliness. Private ovens offered independence but also more risk and expense. The balance varied widely by region and era. You also realised that ovens were linked to safety concerns. Poorly built or maintained ovens could start fires, a terrifying prospect in towns built mostly of wood and thatch. This fear led to strict building codes and inspections. In some towns, unauthorised ovens were seen as not just illegal, but dangerous, threatening the entire community. This regulatory environment meant bakers had to navigate complex rules just to keep their ovens going. Getting caught with an unauthorised oven could mean fines, confiscation, or worse. You picture bakers sneaking around at night, stoking secret ovens hidden in basements or backyards, risking everything to bake more bread or offer specialty goods. You remember the guild's grip, now reinforced by the oven's shadow. Guilds often controlled who could build or use ovens, further tightening their hold on the baking trade. Apprenticeships included training on oven operation, and mastering this skill was essential to moving up in the guild hierarchy. A little-known fact: some medieval bakeries used small portable ovens or clay moulds heated over open fires for specialty breads or pastries. These mini-ovens allowed for experimentation outside the guild's watchful eye, sometimes giving rise to unique local delicacies that survive in folklore. As you watch the glow of embers fade in the dying fire, you think about how the oven was both heart and hurdle for bakers. It was the furnace where bread was born, yet also a source of endless anxiety. Because without the right oven, the best flour and recipes were useless. You breathe in the lingering smell of wood smoke and baking dough, feeling the ancient rhythm of fire and flour pulsing through the bakery. It's a quiet reminder that behind every loaf lies a complex story of craft, control and survival, in a world where the oven's heat was as much a force of law as it was of life. You step back from the fiery glow of the oven and take a moment to consider the people who made bread not just in their own kitchens, but on a grand scale, the bakers' guilds. These guilds weren't just clubs or trade unions, they were powerful social and economic institutions that controlled every aspect of baking, from flour purchase to oven use, from pricing to quality control. To understand why medieval bakers were afraid of bread laws, you have to understand the iron grip these guilds had on the trade. Imagine a medieval guild hall, a place both grand and intimidating, where bakers gathered not just to discuss recipes, but to enforce rules, settle disputes, and protect their monopoly. Membership was mandatory for anyone wanting to sell bread legally, and the guild's power extended into the town's courts and markets. Refusing to join wasn't an option if you wanted to survive. Here's a mainstream fact: guilds regulated apprenticeships, ensuring bakers spent years learning the trade under strict supervision before they could become masters. This system kept quality high, but also controlled competition by limiting how many new bakers could enter the market. It was like an exclusive club with entry fees, oaths, and secret handshakes. The guild also set the prices bakers could charge and standardised the weight and quality of loaves. Breaking these rules meant fines, public humiliation, or even expulsion from the guild, which effectively ended your career. This control was justified as protecting consumers and maintaining fairness, but you can see how it also protected guild members from outside competition. You overhear whispers of bakers who tried to bypass guild rules by selling bread in secret or outside official markets. These rogue bakers were often hunted down by guild enforcers or reported to local authorities. You can almost feel the paranoia. Trust no one who isn't a guild member, especially when the livelihood of many depends on strict enforcement. A quirky tidbit. Some guilds held annual bread trials, where bakers had to demonstrate their skills before a panel of masters, sometimes baking in front of an audience. It was a kind of medieval bake-off, complete with serious judging and the threat of demotion or expulsion if you failed. Imagine the pressure. One bad loaf and your reputation was toast. Historians still debate whether guilds were more beneficial or detrimental to medieval baking. On one hand, they ensured quality and protected small bakers from unfair competition. On the other, they could be monopolistic and stifle innovation by enforcing rigid rules. Either way, their influence was undeniable. Guilds also provided social support, helping members in times of illness or hardship. But this came with the cost of strict conformity and loyalty. You get the sense that guild membership was both a safety net and a cage. You notice how the guilds worked hand in hand with local authorities to enforce bread laws. Guild officials often acted as inspectors or mediators, blurring the lines between trade control and legal enforcement. This fusion made bakers doubly accountable, to both their peers and the crown. A lesser-known fact. Some guilds maintained secret recipes or baking techniques passed down only to trusted members. These secrets were jealously guarded, giving guild bakers an edge over outsiders. This secrecy added to the guild's mystique and power. As you watch a guild meeting in progress, you see the serious faces, the formal oaths, and the intense debates over prices and penalties. The guild's power was palpable, less a friendly association and more a powerful regulatory body shaping every loaf baked in the town. You reflect on how guilds magnified the fear bakers felt of bread laws. It wasn't just the law itself, but the social and economic machinery enforcing it that kept bakers on edge. The guild was both protector and enforcer, friend and foe. In this complex web of fire, flour, law and loyalty, you start to understand that baking in medieval times wasn't just about bread. It was about power, survival, and navigating a world where every loaf carried the weight of society's expectations. You're still feeling the weight of the guild's watchful eyes as you move deeper into the medieval baker's world. But now your focus shifts to the secret currency of their trade: flour. More than just an ingredient, flour was the backbone of baking economics and a key factor in the fear of bread laws. Without the right flour, even the most skilled baker could find themselves in trouble, so understanding how flour was produced, traded and regulated is essential. You picture a bustling mill on the outskirts of town, water wheel turning steadily as it crushes grain into flour with rhythmic precision. Mills were technological marvels of the medieval period, and controlling access to them was a strategic move for bakers and lords alike. You get that the flour from these mills wasn't just food, it was a precious commodity, a form of medieval gold dust. Here's a mainstream fact. Most medieval towns had at least one mill, often owned by the local lord or the church, who charged millers and bakers a fee or multure for grinding grain. This system ensured a steady income for the powerful, but also meant that mill access was a source of tension for bakers, who needed affordable, reliable flour to stay afloat. You imagine bakers nervously negotiating mill fees, trying to secure better rates or special treatment. A bad milling season, whether due to drought, war or sabotage, could send flour prices soaring, and with it, the price of bread. You can almost taste the panic as bakers scramble to adjust prices within the constraints of bread laws. There's an open scholarly debate about how much control mill owners exerted over the bread trade. Some historians argue mills were used to monopolise flour production, driving up prices and squeezing bakers. Others suggest mills were simply part of a broader economic system that balanced supply and demand in a sometimes volatile market. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some mills had mill ghosts in local folklore, spirits believed to protect the grain or punish thieves. Superstitions like these sometimes influenced how millers treated their machines and customers, adding a mystical layer to what was otherwise a very practical business. The quality of flour also mattered enormously. White flour, made from finely ground wheat, was prized by the wealthy and often reserved for luxury breads. Coarser flours, made from rye, barley or mixed grains, were the staple for common folk. bakers had to balance their customers' expectations with what was economically feasible, all while staying within the legal framework. You see how bakers could be tempted to adulterate flour with cheaper fillers like bran or sawdust to stretch supplies, a risky move that could lead to legal trouble. Bread laws often explicitly forbade such practices, but enforcement was patchy, and the temptation was strong during hard times. You also learn about the seasonal rhythms of grain and flour supply. Harvest times brought relief and lower prices, while winters and famines tightened the market. Bakers had to be savvy in managing their flour stocks, sometimes hoarding or trading behind the scenes to hedge against shortages. A lesser-known fact: in some towns, bakers formed secret flour buying alliances to negotiate better prices or to keep rival bakers from obtaining enough flour. This created a shadow economy that was rarely visible but had a big impact on the market. Flour's journey from field to oven was fraught with uncertainty. Bad weather, war, or political unrest could disrupt grain shipments, sending shockwaves through baking communities. You imagine the tension in a baker's workshop when news of a bad harvest arrived. Would you raise prices and risk fines, or sell at a loss and hope for the best? All this pressure around flour explains part of why bakers feared bread laws so much. It wasn't just the threat of inspectors or guilds, it was the fragile supply chain and economic forces beyond their control. Baking bread became a high-wire act balancing quality, legality, and profitability. You breathe in the faint scent of freshly ground flour, imagining the mill's rhythmic turning as a heartbeat connecting field, bakery, and market. Flour was the true currency of medieval baking, and controlling it meant controlling life itself. In this intricate dance of grain and law, you see how bakers' fears were grounded not just in penalties, but in the very real uncertainty of the medieval economy. The story of bread laws is inseparable from the story of flour, both the foundation and the fault line beneath medieval bread. You're now deep into the economic web that wrapped around medieval bakers, and a new player emerges on this stage: the grain merchants and market traders who acted as middlemen between farmers, millers, and bakers. These figures were crucial to the medieval bread supply chain, but often complicated it with their own interests, marking another source of tension that fed bakers' anxieties about bread laws. Picture a bustling market square filled with crates of golden wheat, sacks of rye, and piles of barley. Grain merchants shout prices, haggle fiercely, and keep a wary eye on competitors and authorities alike. These merchants controlled much of the grain flow into towns and cities, setting prices that could make or break bakers. You realise how bakers depended heavily on them, yet often distrusted them. Here's a mainstream fact: grain merchants often operated under royal charters, granting them certain monopolies or privileges. This official status allowed them to influence grain availability and prices, sometimes leading to accusations of price gouging or hoarding, especially during poor harvest years or famines. You feel the tension as bakers navigate this relationship, buying grain at fluctuating prices, sometimes forced into unfavourable deals. This precarious dependence added pressure to maintain compliance with bread laws that fix loaf prices and weights, limiting bakers' ability to adjust their own prices to cover rising costs. A quirky tidbit: some grain merchants were known to use grain weights, marked with secret symbols or hidden compartments to cheat buyers, a medieval version of rigged scales. These tricks could pass unnoticed by bakers but fueled suspicion and conflict within the trade. Historians still argue about the extent to which grain merchants manipulated markets for profit versus simply responding to supply and demand. Some see merchants as villains who exploited shortages, others view them as vital players in a complex economy struggling to balance food security. You imagine the market's darker corners where illegal grain trading happened, black markets and secret deals that defied guilds and authorities. Bakers occasionally tapped into these to get better flour prices or special grain varieties, risking fines or worse if caught. The grain market was also deeply affected by politics. Wars, embargoes, and local conflicts could disrupt supply routes, sending shockwaves through markets and bakeries. You sense the fear bakers must have felt when grain shipments were delayed or seized, leaving them scrambling to meet bread law requirements with limited resources. Another lesser-known fact: some medieval towns appointed grain watchers, or market overseers, who patrolled markets to prevent fraud, hoarding, and speculation. These officials worked alongside bread inspectors, creating a network of surveillance that added to bakers' unease. The pressure wasn't just economic but social. Grain merchants often belonged to influential families or guilds themselves, and their power could sway local politics. Bakers who challenged grain merchants risked social ostracism or retaliation, a dangerous gamble in tightly knit communities. You also see how seasonal rhythms affected grain trade. After harvest, prices dropped and supplies were abundant. In winter or drought, scarcity drove prices up. Bakers had to time their purchases carefully, sometimes risking storage losses or spoilage to maintain enough flour for production. This intricate dance of supply, demand and regulation reveals why medieval bakers were so wary of bread laws. These laws locked them into fixed prices and weights. But behind the scenes, bakers faced volatile grain markets controlled by powerful merchants with their own agendas. As you take in the noisy market scene, you feel the invisible chains tying bakers to grain merchants and bread laws alike. Bakers weren't just craftsmen, they were players in a high-stakes economic drama where one bad deal could topple their livelihoods. So next time you bite into a loaf of bread, remember the unseen struggles baked into it, the negotiations, market manipulations and legal battles that shaped every crumb. It wasn't just flour and yeast, but politics, power and fear that rose with the dough. You've now seen how ovens, guilds, flour and grain merchants formed the backbone of medieval baking, but there's another invisible force shaping bakers' lives: money, credit and debt. Financial realities in the Middle Ages were a constant pressure cooker, turning the simple act of baking bread into a tightrope walk between solvency and ruin, especially under the weight of bread laws. Picture yourself standing inside a baker's modest shop, sacks of flour stacked against walls, baskets of loaves cooling on shelves, and coins jingling in a worn leather pouch. Yet despite the busy scene, behind that counter lies a world of financial juggling that could make even the calmest baker sweat. You start to grasp how credit and debt were as much part of baking as flour and fire. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval bakers rarely operated with cash in hand. Most of their business was done on credit, both buying supplies and selling bread. Farmers, millers, and grain merchants often extended credit, as did the baker to customers, especially in poor or rural areas. This system tied bakers into complicated webs of financial obligations, often overlapping and precarious. You imagine how a bad harvest or a delayed payment could send a baker spiralling into debt. Because bread laws fixed prices and loaf sizes, bakers had little flexibility to raise prices to cover increased costs, making debts harder to repay. The rigid laws turned baking into a financially fragile venture. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers kept detailed bread ledgers, handwritten records tracking every loaf sold on credit, every debt owed by suppliers, and every payment received. These ledgers could become works of art in their own right, filled with flour-dusted notes, doodles, and even prayers for good harvests and loyal customers. Historians still argue whether bread laws ultimately helped bakers by stabilizing prices or hurt them by restricting their economic freedom. Some suggest the laws created artificial scarcity and debt traps, while others see them as necessary protections for both bakers and consumers. You picture the precarious balance bakers had to maintain, buying enough flour and fuel on credit to bake bread, but selling it within strict price limits, hoping customers would pay up on time. Failure on either side meant financial collapse, sometimes forcing bakers to mortgage their ovens, homes or tools. Credit wasn't just financial, but social too. Bakers' reputations affected their ability to borrow or sell on trust. A bad reputation could close doors as surely as a law's penalty. You realise how the fear of bread law inspections wasn't just about fines, but about reputation, which could determine survival. A lesser-known fact: some bakers formed informal lending clubs within guilds or communities, pooling resources to help each other in times of crisis. These clubs resembled early credit unions, offering short-term loans or guarantees. Yet these safety nets were fragile and could break under economic stress. You also discover that debt collectors and legal agents played a harsh role in medieval baking life. When bakers defaulted on loans, creditors could seize goods or property, or worse, push for imprisonment. The threat of debt imprisonment loomed over many, adding another layer of fear beyond bread laws. Economic crises, such as famines, wars, or plagues, intensified these problems. When grain and flour prices spiked, bakers could not legally raise bread prices, forcing them into deeper debt or bankruptcy. You can almost hear the grinding despair in a baker's shop during these times. You begin to see the baking business as a kind of economic juggling act under constant threat. Bread laws, while ostensibly protecting consumers from exploitation, often squeezed bakers between rising costs and fixed prices, pushing them into debt cycles. As you watch a baker close shop after a long day, counting coins and tallying debts by candlelight, you feel the invisible weight that bread laws imposed. Baking was not just a craft, but a financial gamble, and many bakers lived with the gnawing fear of losing it all. In this world where every loaf carried economic risk, you start to understand why medieval bakers were afraid, not just of the laws themselves, but of the financial traps those laws could tighten around them. You keep walking down the narrow, winding streets of the medieval market town, and now your ears pick up the faint murmur of the crowd gathered at the town square. It's not just gossip about the latest plague or the Duke's tax hikes. It's the buzz around the bread riots, those tense, often violent protests sparked by bread shortages or price hikes. These riots provide another vivid lens into why bakers were terrified of bread laws and their enforcement. Imagine standing in the square, pressed against a throng of anxious faces. The smell of smoke, sweat, and desperation hangs in the air, mingling with the faint scent of stale bread. You feel the pulse of the crowd, angry and hungry, their eyes darting toward the bakers' shops. Bread was life, and when the bread failed, so did the fragile social order. A mainstream fact, bread riots were surprisingly common throughout medieval Europe, particularly during times of famine, bad harvests, or economic hardship. These uprisings often targeted not only bakers but also millers, merchants and local officials accused of hoarding grain or inflating prices. Sometimes the mobs would storm granaries or bakeries, seizing bread and flour by force. You catch the tension in the air. Bakers, already stressed by guild rules and bread laws, had to face the additional threat of popular outrage. This fear often pushed bakers to comply strictly with price laws, even when it meant selling at a loss, just to avoid being the next target of a riot. Here's a quirky tidbit. During some riots, angry mobs used all sorts of makeshift weapons, from rotten vegetables to kitchen utensils. One particularly memorable uprising in 14th century Paris reportedly involved bread baskets being used as battering rams. You can't help but imagine the surreal image of loaves flying both as weapons and as symbols of survival. Historians still debate whether bread riots were primarily spontaneous acts of desperation, or politically motivated protests manipulated by local factions. Some see them as early expressions of popular resistance against unfair economic control, while others view them as chaotic eruptions driven by hunger. You overhear stories of bakers caught in impossible positions, forced by law to sell bread at prices too low to cover their costs, but terrified to raise prices lest they become targets of public wrath. Some were even accused falsely of hoarding or adulterating bread, making them scapegoats in tense times. You learn that local authorities often intervened harshly to suppress bread riots, deploying militia or troops to restore order. Punishments for rioters could be severe, but so could penalties for bakers who violated bread laws. It was a delicate balancing act to keep peace and maintain the food supply. A lesser-known fact, in some cases, rulers personally intervened during bread crises, ordering public bakings or distributing grain to calm unrest. These acts were both humanitarian gestures and political strategies to maintain control and prevent uprisings. You start to understand how bread laws were not just about economics or quality control, but were deeply tied to social stability. Bakers were caught between the demands of the law and the wrath of the people, walking a razor's edge. The tension you feel isn't just historical. It echoes in modern food security debates and protests. The fear bakers felt centuries ago resonates today, reminding you that bread has always been more than just food. It's a symbol of life, justice, and survival. As the crowd in the square grows louder, you step back, feeling the charged atmosphere ripple through time. The fear of bread laws was not just fear of legal penalties, but fear of social upheaval and the unpredictable power of hungry people. In this simmering cauldron of law, economics, and anger, you glimpse the human cost behind every loaf. Bakers' fears, rulers' anxieties, and the desperate hopes of hungry crowds. It's a world where the humble loaf carried the weight of society itself. You keep your place on the crowded streets, but now shift your attention to the inspectors, the bread law enforcers who, with their watchful eyes and measuring sticks, prowled the medieval towns like a mix between tax collectors and food police. These inspectors were a source of deep dread for bakers, embodying the very real threat of punishment and public shame that bread laws could bring. Imagine a scene where an inspector steps into a bakery early in the morning, clipboard in hand, scrutinising the loaves cooling on the racks. The baker stands nervously by, wiping sweat from their brow, heart pounding. The inspector pulls out a scale, a measure, and maybe even a stick for poking, checking weight, size and quality, with the seriousness of a judge. One misstep and the consequences could be harsh. A mainstream fact. Bread inspectors were officially appointed by local or royal authorities and had the power to confiscate substandard loaves, fine bakers, or even close shops temporarily. Their role was to protect consumers from fraud and ensure fair market conditions, but in practice their presence often caused anxiety and resentment among bakers. You hear about how inspectors often worked in teams, sometimes accompanied by local officials or even guild representatives. This collaboration made inspections thorough and intimidating. For bakers, it wasn't just about getting caught breaking the rules, but about surviving the ordeal of inspection itself, with its potential for public humiliation. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some inspectors carried standardised measuring sticks called bread measures, which were actually quite inventive for their time, with carved notches to measure loaf size precisely. There were even regional variations, so bakers travelling between towns had to adjust their baking or face fines, a medieval version of varying speed limits or tax zones. Historians still debate whether inspectors acted more as honest protectors of the public or as tools of oppressive regulation. Some accounts suggest inspectors could be bribed or intimidated, while others describe zealous enforcement that crushed small bakers under rigid rules. You imagine how inspections could disrupt the delicate balance of a bakery's day. Timing was critical. An inspector showing up during the busy morning rush could throw the entire operation into chaos. This unpredictability added another layer of stress to an already demanding job. A lesser-known fact: in some towns, inspectors also collected samples of flour or dough to test for adulteration, which required a crude form of medieval food science. The sophistication of these tests varied, but the mere possibility of chemical scrutiny was enough to keep bakers on edge. You feel the baker's humiliation when an inspector publicly confiscated loaves or issued fines. Such events could damage reputations and customer trust, sometimes causing irreparable harm to a baker's business. You also discover that some bakers tried creative tactics to avoid fines, from subtly adjusting loaf weights before inspections to hiding extra bread in secret compartments. These small acts of defiance were part of the ongoing cat-and-mouse game between bakers and inspectors. The psychological toll on bakers was significant. The fear of inspection meant they baked with constant worry, adjusting recipes and loaf sizes to meet exacting standards rather than focusing on creativity or customer satisfaction. Baking became a regulated ritual rather than an art. You realise that inspectors weren't just law enforcers, they were symbols of the broader tension between control and freedom, tradition and change. Their presence shaped how bakers lived, worked, and thought about their craft. As you watch the inspector leave the bakery, clipboard filled with notes, you feel the relief mingled with lingering fear. Tomorrow, it might be a different inspector, a different test, a different threat. In this world of strict surveillance and legal oversight, the medieval baker's fear of bread laws wasn't paranoia. It was a daily reality lived under the gaze of a watchful eyes, measuring sticks, and the ever-present threat of penalty. You walk away from the inspector's visit and let your senses drift to the sensory world of the medieval bakery itself. The smells, sights, and sounds that made baking a deeply physical, even magical craft, despite all the restrictions imposed by bread laws. You come to appreciate that behind the fear and rules, baking was still an art form, full of ritual and tradition, a moment of warmth and creation in a harsh world. The scent of yeast, warm crust, and wood smoke fills the air, mingling with the grit of flour dust. You imagine the baker's hands kneading dough, rough and calloused but deft, coaxing life into a mixture of simple ingredients. There's a primal joy in this work, a rhythm tied to centuries of practice, passed down from master to apprentice. A mainstream fact, baking in the Middle Ages was a skill learned over years of apprenticeship, often within guilds. The guilds regulated not only business practices, but also training, ensuring a certain standard of craftsmanship, which was essential in a time when bread quality was literally a matter of life and death. You notice the importance of timing and temperature, even in ovens fueled by wood or charcoal, where controlling heat was more art than science. Bakers had to judge by feel and sight, knowing when the crust was just right or the loaf fully baked, a skill refined over countless loaves. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers used animal fat or even honey in their dough to achieve different textures and flavours. Others swore by adding herbs or spices, not just for taste but for supposed health benefits. Imagine biting into a loaf lightly scented with rosemary or anise. Medieval comfort food with a twist. Historians still argue whether the guild's focus on standardisation stifled innovation or preserved essential quality. While some say bread laws and guild rules limited creative freedom, others believe they maintained a basic level of public health and fairness. You envision the bakery's daily cycle: early mornings, the heat of the oven, the steady pace of shaping dough, the welcoming warmth of fresh bread cooling on wooden boards. This rhythm gave structure to the baker's life, grounding them amid the chaos of medieval existence. You also consider the social role of the bakery as a community hub. Bakers often exchanged news, gossip, and advice with customers and neighbours. The bakery was a place of social connection, where people gathered to collect their daily bread and share moments of camaraderie. A lesser-known fact: in some regions, bakers had superstitions about the first loaf of the day, believing it should be reserved for a saint, the poor, or even the bakery's spirit. These traditions blended the practical with the mystical, reminding you how medieval life intertwined faith and daily toil. You realise that despite the fear of inspections and laws, the bakery was a sanctuary, a place where the alchemy of flour, water, yeast, and fire transformed into sustenance and comfort. Bakers took pride in their craft even when constrained by outside forces. The tactile nature of baking, the dough slipping between fingers, the heat of the oven, the weight of a loaf, offered a tangible sense of accomplishment that transcended legal worries. It was a moment of creation in a world often marked by scarcity and hardship. You picture the baker's small celebrations, offering a taste of a special bread to a favoured customer, or sneaking a warm crust during a long day. These moments of joy, though small, sustained them through the constant pressure of guilds, inspectors, and bread laws. The sensory world of the bakery, you see, was both a refuge and a battleground. It was where the fear of bread laws met the hope and resilience of human hands, shaping simple ingredients into something essential. As you leave the bakery, the scent of fresh bread lingers, a reminder that amid rules and restrictions, life found a way to rise, just like the dough, slowly, steadily, full of potential. You step back from the warmth of the bakery's hearth and drift into the marketplace's wider rhythms, where the politics of bread, far more tangled than simple baking rules, take centre stage. Bread laws weren't just about loaves, they were political tools wielded by rulers trying to control the populace, stabilise economies, and sometimes keep power firmly in their own hands. This is where the fear bakers felt gets tangled in the broader game of medieval politics and governance. Imagine yourself in the grand hall of the town's governing council, heavy wooden beams overhead, and the air thick with smoke and voices debating the latest grain shortage or price spike. Here, decisions about bread laws were made, sometimes in the name of fairness, often to prevent unrest, and occasionally to assert authority over rebellious townsfolk or unruly guilds. A mainstream fact: monarchs and local rulers frequently enacted bread laws as part of their broader efforts to regulate food supply and prevent famine-related unrest. These laws were often reinforced by harsh penalties, including fines, imprisonment, or even corporal punishment for violators, reflecting how seriously bread, and thus social order, was taken. You can feel the pressure mounting as rulers used bread laws to demonstrate control. When bread was scarce or too expensive, people's frustration could quickly turn into rebellion. So, enforcing strict rules on bakers was one way to show that the ruling class was doing something, even if those laws sometimes made bakers' lives unbearable. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some rulers issued bread charters, symbolic proclamations asserting their right to regulate bread supply, sometimes accompanied by elaborate ceremonies involving the weighing of the first loaf of the season, a public display of power wrapped in ritual. Historians still argue whether these laws truly helped maintain order or simply masked deeper problems like inefficient grain production or poor economic policies. Some view them as early social safety nets, others as repressive controls that punished the wrong people, especially the bakers caught in the middle. You get a sense of how bakers were often pawns in this political chess game. While they had to comply with laws to avoid punishment, they also became scapegoats during times of crisis. A bad harvest, bad weather or war might be the real cause of bread scarcity, but bakers bore the brunt of popular anger and official blame. A lesser-known fact: in some towns, bakers' guild leaders sat on councils or advised rulers on food policy, giving them a voice in the political process. But even with this influence, their power was limited, often overshadowed by wealthier merchants or nobility. You imagine the political theatre surrounding bread, the public weighing of loaves, the issuing of proclamations, the parade of inspectors, each a performance reinforcing who held power and who was expected to obey. This political dimension added to bakers' fear. They weren't just baking bread. They were baking under the watchful eyes of rulers who might use their ovens as symbols of control. Non-compliance wasn't just a business risk. It could be seen as defiance against authority. You start to notice how this dynamic parallels modern food politics. Subsidies, price controls, and trade embargoes echo the medieval rulers' attempts to stabilize markets and placate unrest. Bread laws were early forms of food regulation that reflected broader struggles over governance and control. The political pressure also meant that bread laws could shift suddenly. A new ruler might relax or tighten regulations. A war could lead to rationing or price freezes. Bakers had to be flexible and always alert, caught in the crossfire of changing policies. You picture the exhaustion of a baker who, after a long day's work, has to attend a town meeting to hear new edicts or explain why their bread doesn't meet the latest standard. The mix of politics, economics, and daily toil was overwhelming. Yet despite this, bakers often found ways to resist or adapt, secretly adjusting loaf sizes, collaborating with millers for better flour, or negotiating with inspectors were small acts of defiance or survival within a rigid system. In this tangled web of power and law and daily bread, the fear bakers felt was not irrational paranoia, but a response to the real stakes of their craft. Every loaf was a potential trigger for political unrest or legal punishment, making baking a high-wire act with no safety net. As you walk away from the council hall, the weight of centuries-old power struggles seems to settle on your shoulders, reminding you that the humble loaf has long been a battleground where politics and survival mix in complex, often dangerous ways. You leave the hall of political power behind and step into the quieter, shadowy corners of medieval towns, where bakers lived and worked outside the direct glare of inspectors and rulers. Here, you witness the everyday realities that shaped their lives, how family, apprenticeships, and guild obligations created a complex social web underpinning the baking trade and amplifying the fear of bread laws. Imagine wandering down a narrow alley lined with timber-framed houses, the warm glow of hearth fires flickering behind small windows. You hear the chatter of families and apprentices, the clinking of tools, and the occasional shout of a master baker calling instructions. Baking was not a solitary job. It was a household affair, often spanning generations. A mainstream fact: most medieval bakers learned their craft through lengthy apprenticeships, sometimes lasting 7 years or more, living with the master baker's family and absorbing not just skills but the guild's strict code of conduct. Apprentices were legally bound to their masters and expected to uphold the high standards demanded by bread laws and guild rules. You can almost see the pressure weighing on young apprentices, caught between learning an art and navigating a minefield of regulations. They had to memorize recipes, master oven management, and memorize legal requirements like loaf weights and prices. One mistake could mean fines or worse for their master. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some apprentices had to wear special badges or tokens marking their status, making them visible symbols of the guild's presence in town. Losing such a badge was considered a serious offence, almost like losing your identity in the baking community. Historians still debate how guild culture affected bakers' innovation. While guilds maintained quality and order, some argue they stifled creativity, locking bakers into rigid traditions to ensure compliance with bread laws and social expectations. You begin to see how guild membership created a protective but also confining environment. Bakers received legal support and training but had little freedom to deviate from established rules. The guild acted as both shield and jailer, reinforcing the fear of law-breaking. You glimpse the intense social hierarchy within guilds, from apprentices to journeymen to masters, each level carrying its own privileges and risks. Rising to master status meant earning the right to open your own shop, but also taking on the full burden of legal responsibility. A lesser-known fact: guild meetings often included not only business but social rituals, feasts, religious observances, and mutual aid funds for sick or injured bakers. These gatherings helped build solidarity but also reinforced conformity and compliance with bread laws. You see how family life intertwined with baking. Wives, children, and extended kin were often involved in the work, kneading dough, managing accounts, or selling bread in markets. This integration of home and business made bread laws' impact deeply personal. The guild's watchful eye extended beyond the bakery to social conduct. Bakers were expected to uphold moral behaviour and community standards, with penalties for drunkenness or dishonesty. Violating bread laws could thus tarnish not only business but personal reputation. You imagine the whispered conversations after inspections or fines, the stress passed from master to apprentice, from one generation to the next. Fear of bread laws wasn't just legal, it was embedded in daily life and relationships. You also discover stories of apprentices who ran away to avoid the harsh discipline or legal consequences, seeking freedom but risking blacklisting or worse. Guilds kept tight records, making escape difficult. This social fabric made bakers both resilient and vulnerable. The guild system provided structure and support, but also amplified the fear of falling foul of bread laws, since one violation could damage not just a business, but a whole family's future. You realise that baking was not just a trade, but a lifelong identity, shaped by community, law, and tradition. The fear bakers carried was woven into the very fabric of their social existence, a weight shared across generations. As you move away from the alleys and guild halls, you carry with you a new understanding. Medieval baking was a complex social dance where every step, every loaf, every measure, every law had consequences far beyond the oven. You step further into the world of medieval bread by exploring the economics behind those crusty loaves, how the fluctuating price of grain and the financial struggles of bakers fed into their fear of bread laws. You quickly realise baking was not just a craft or a social role, but a tightrope walk in the unpredictable economic landscape of the Middle Ages. Picture yourself standing by a grain merchant's stall, where sacks of wheat and rye tower precariously, their prices shifting daily with harvest yields, wars, and even weather patterns. The medieval economy was precarious, with grain often the most valuable commodity, and the price swings could make or break a baker's business overnight. A mainstream fact: grain prices fluctuated wildly due to bad harvests, wars disrupting trade routes, and local scarcity. When grain was expensive, bakers faced impossible choices: bake smaller loaves, dilute dough with cheaper grains, or risk violating bread laws by raising prices. You hear the anxiety in bakers' voices as they explain the pinch of tight margins. Bread laws often froze prices or set maximum prices, leaving bakers unable to pass on increased costs to customers without risking legal punishment. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers tried creative recipes using chestnuts, acorns, or even dried peas mixed with grain to stretch scarce flour supplies during tough times. These substitutions often produced odd-tasting breads that were tolerated only in desperate moments. Imagine bread with a hint of forest nut crunch. Historians still argue whether these price controls helped stabilise food supplies or inadvertently caused shortages by discouraging production. Some claim bread laws protected the poor, others say they punished bakers unfairly and encouraged black markets. You get a sense of the constant balancing act bakers faced: comply with bread laws and risk financial ruin, or bend the rules and face harsh penalties. The economic pressure was relentless, pushing some bakers into debt or forcing them to give up the trade altogether. You also learn about the role of millers, who controlled the grain's transformation into flour, adding another economic layer. Millers often set their own fees, sometimes sparking conflicts with bakers over rising costs, further complicating the economics of bread production. A lesser-known fact: in some towns, local authorities regulated milling fees alongside bread prices, trying to manage the entire supply chain. But these regulations were hard to enforce consistently, leading to tensions and occasional conspiracies between millers and bakers. You imagine the creative accounting bakers had to master, calculating cost per loaf, juggling debts, and planning for lean seasons. Money was as much a part of baking as flour and yeast. The fear of bread laws, you see, was also a fear of economic collapse. A single misjudgment could trigger fines that drained cash reserves, or accusations of price gouging that ruined reputations and sales. You picture a baker's shop closing because the owner couldn't survive the economic squeeze or the legal consequences of bending bread laws. Behind every closed door was a story of struggle, fear, and sometimes defeat. At the same time, the bakery was a beacon of hope. Steady demand for bread meant a chance to rebuild, to innovate, or to band together with other bakers to resist unfair regulations. You notice the formation of informal networks where bakers shared tips on surviving tough economic times, secret recipes, flour suppliers, or strategies to avoid inspectors. This underground economy was a subtle form of resistance. You also realise that some bakers operated in grey markets, selling bread unofficially or under the table to avoid price controls. This riskier path could yield profits but also harsher punishments if discovered. You see parallels with modern economic challenges, price controls, black markets, and the tension between regulation and survival have been baked into the human story for centuries. As you leave the grain stall behind, you carry with you the heavy truth. Medieval bakers' fear of bread laws wasn't just about law-breaking, but about economic survival, in a world where the price of flour could rise or fall like the tide, and a single loaf could represent a razor-thin margin between success and ruin. You step away from the economic hustle and bustle of the marketplace, and now follow the quieter, often overlooked path of women in the medieval baking world. How their roles, influence, and often invisible labour shaped the fears and realities surrounding bread laws. The female presence in bakeries was not just about kneading dough. It was deeply entwined with family economies, guild politics, and the social fabric that both constrained and empowered them. Imagine a small kitchen behind the shop, warm with the heat of the oven, where a woman, wife, daughter, or sister of the baker, works tirelessly. Her hands mix dough, tend fires, and package bread for sale, all while managing the household and children. She navigates the rules with quiet expertise, her knowledge essential to the bakery's survival. A mainstream fact, women frequently participated in baking, especially in smaller towns or rural areas where baking was a domestic activity. In many cases, women handled substantial portions of production and sale, even if guild regulations officially limited their recognition or status. You hear whispers about women running informal baking businesses, sometimes without guild membership, which put them at particular risk of fines and legal action under bread laws. Their work straddled public and private spheres, often invisible to authorities but vital for feeding families and communities. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval recipes credited to bakers' wives included secret ingredients or methods passed down through generations, like a pinch of clove for warmth, or the careful timing of oven use to save fuel. These culinary secrets helped differentiate breads and sustain local traditions. Historians still debate how much power women held within guilds and baking communities. While some argue they were marginalised and excluded from formal trade rights, others suggest women exerted significant influence behind the scenes, shaping business decisions and preserving craft knowledge. You sense the tension women faced, balancing traditional gender roles with the practical necessity of bread production. The fear of bread laws was compounded by the added risk that their unofficial status made them more vulnerable to inspection and punishment. You also glimpse the resilience and creativity women showed. When guilds or laws restricted their roles, women found ways to contribute through home baking, barter networks, or managing smaller stalls, quietly keeping bread on the table and the family afloat. A lesser-known fact, in some towns, women formed their own informal networks or cooperatives to support each other through difficult times, sharing resources, flour, and legal advice. Early examples of female solidarity in a male-dominated trade. You imagine the emotional labour involved, worrying not just about loaf size or oven temperature but about family survival, legal penalties, and community reputation. Women's work often blended economic necessity with care, making their role in the baking world deeply complex. You also find stories of women who challenged norms, becoming master bakers or guild members in exceptional cases, pushing boundaries and expanding what was possible, despite legal and social constraints. You notice how women's involvement varied by region and social class, with rural women more likely to bake for household needs, while urban women might participate in commercial baking under varying degrees of regulation. This gendered dimension adds a rich layer to your understanding of bread laws. They were not only about commerce and politics, but about who got to bake, sell and control one of society's most essential foods. You sense that the fear bakers felt about bread laws was experienced differently depending on gender. What might be a business risk for a master baker could be a threat to family survival for a woman baking on the margins. As you leave the warm kitchen behind, the soft sounds of dough kneading and quiet conversation linger, reminding you that the history of bread is also a story of women's hands shaping sustenance, law, and life in ways often hidden but profoundly felt. You move deeper into the texture of medieval baking by exploring the role of the guild inspectors, the dreaded enforcers who turned bread laws from written rules into lived fear. These inspectors were the ones who physically entered bakeries, measured loaves, and judged whether the bread met the official standards, becoming symbols of authority and dread for bakers everywhere. Imagine yourself standing at the bakery's threshold, the morning light filtering through flour-dusted windows, when suddenly a stern, uniformed figure steps inside. The inspector's eyes scan every corner, every loaf, every scale. His presence is a tangible reminder that bread laws were no abstract concept, but a force ready to punish any misstep. A mainstream fact. Inspectors were appointed by guilds or municipal authorities to enforce bread laws, with powers to seize bread, levy fines, and even shut down shops temporarily. Their authority was backed by the threat of legal action, making their visits highly stressful events for bakers. You can almost feel the tension in the air during these inspections, the careful hiding of smaller or heavier loaves, the nervous glances exchanged among workers. The inspector's role was as much psychological as legal, a constant surveillance that kept bakers on edge. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some inspectors carried a breadstick, a wooden measuring rod engraved with official standards used to check loaf sizes quickly. Losing or damaging this tool was considered a serious offence, akin to losing the king's seal. Historians still argue about inspectors' effectiveness and fairness. Some portray them as overzealous and corrupt, accepting bribes or targeting certain bakers unfairly, while others emphasise their role in protecting consumers and maintaining quality. You sense that inspectors were caught in their own dilemma, enforcing unpopular laws while maintaining relationships with bakers and townsfolk. Their job was precarious, balancing authority with diplomacy. You also learn about the inspectors' techniques, surprise visits at dawn, checking oven temperatures with crude devices, or weighing loaves on heavy scales. They developed a sharp eye for detecting flour substitutions or dough dilution, skills honed by experience and gossip. A lesser-known fact: inspectors sometimes used sting tactics, sending undercover agents posing as customers to catch bakers selling illegal bread sizes or weights. This added a layer of mistrust and paranoia to the baking community. You imagine the inspector's daily routine, trudging through muddy streets, juggling complaints from consumers, negotiating with bakers, and reporting back to guild councils or city officials. The role was exhausting and often thankless. You also picture the social dynamics: the baker who grudgingly greets the inspector, the apprentice who hides illicit loaves, the shopkeeper who nervously tries to charm their way out of trouble. Every inspection was a mini-drama playing out under the heat of the oven. This constant scrutiny magnified bakers' fear of bread laws. Even a minor infraction could result in penalties severe enough to ruin a business or tarnish a family's reputation. You reflect on how the presence of inspectors shaped baking culture, promoting conformity, but also driving some bakers to innovate stealthily, finding loopholes or using clever techniques to pass inspections undetected. You note parallels with modern regulatory inspectors, from health officials to tax auditors, whose roles blend enforcement with negotiation, authority with human fallibility. As you leave the bakery, the memory of the inspector's watchful eyes lingers, a reminder that behind every loaf lay a delicate balance of trust, law, and survival, with the inspector as both guardian and adversary in the medieval baking drama. You wander from the inspector's imposing figure and into the gritty world of black markets and illicit baking, the shadowy underbelly of medieval bread trade where fear of bread laws pushed bakers and buyers into secret, risky deals. Here, the officially sanctioned loaf was not always the loaf you got, and the cost of breaking bread laws was often outweighed by the need to survive. Imagine slipping through a narrow backstreet market as dusk falls, lanterns flickering and voices lowered in secret. You watch as a baker exchanges a sack of unofficial flour for coins under the table, or a customer eagerly takes a loaf too small, too heavy, or suspiciously dark, knowing full well it wouldn't pass inspection. A mainstream fact: black markets for bread and grain flourished especially during famines, wars, or harsh price controls. When official bread laws made legal loaves too expensive or scarce, underground networks stepped in to meet demand, often at inflated prices and with questionable quality. You can almost feel the tension in these shadow trades, buyers and sellers both risking fines or imprisonment. Yet the black market thrived because it fulfilled basic needs ignored or suppressed by official policies. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some illicit bakers operated out of secret ovens hidden in basements, cellars, or abandoned buildings. These ghost bakeries produced bread under the cover of darkness, often using forbidden ingredients or unconventional methods to stretch flour further. Historians still debate the scale and impact of these black markets. Some argue they undermined bread laws and contributed to economic instability, while others see them as essential survival mechanisms in a rigid, often unjust system. You sense the complicated morality of this underground trade. Illicit, yes, but often born of necessity rather than greed. The fear bakers felt was twofold: fear of law enforcement and fear of starvation if official routes failed. You also discover how black markets affected social relations. Neighbours might turn a blind eye or even cooperate, trading loaves informally, while authorities cracked down harshly on suspected illicit bakers to send a warning. A lesser-known fact: some black market bakers use secret codes or symbols on their bread, marks made by shaping the crust or scoring patterns, to signal quality or trustworthiness to savvy customers, creating an underground language of bread. You imagine the cat-and-mouse game between inspectors and underground bakers, raids, arrests, and yet the black market enduring through ingenuity and local support. You also note the role of smuggling in this world: grain or flour brought in from neighbouring regions where prices were lower or laws more lenient, bypassing local restrictions. This underground economy reveals how rigid laws sometimes failed to reflect the lived realities of communities, forcing people to improvise and adapt beyond official rules. You picture the desperation driving these trades: a mother needing bread to feed her children, a baker trying to keep his family afloat, customers choosing risk over hunger. The existence of black markets adds depth to your understanding of why medieval bakers feared bread laws. The penalties were severe, the risks high, but the consequences of strict compliance could be even worse. You also reflect on how this dynamic echoes modern parallels, from illicit food markets to regulatory loopholes, highlighting timeless tensions between law, economy, and survival. As you fade from the shadowed streets back to the brighter, regulated market squares, you carry with you the knowledge that behind every loaf, official or secret, lies a story of fear, defiance, and the human will to endure. You drift away from the back-alley dealings and into the bustling, sometimes chaotic world of medieval marketplaces, where the ultimate test of bread laws came alive: the public loaf sale. Here, the tension between bakers, buyers, and officials played out daily in the open air, with crowds, noise, and the watchful eyes of local authorities making every transaction a small drama. Picture yourself standing in a crowded town square, where stalls overflow with fresh bread, the smell of yeast and baked crusts mingling with the tang of livestock and wood smoke. Buyers haggle, children tug at parents' cloaks, and bakers shout to attract customers, all under the stern gaze of officials holding scales and measuring rods. A mainstream fact: marketplaces were central hubs for enforcing bread laws. Town authorities often stationed officials in these busy spots to oversee sales, ensuring loaves met weight and price regulations and preventing fraud or hoarding. You feel the palpable tension as bakers try to balance the desire to make a profit with the strict rules they must follow. Selling bread that's too small or too heavy could mean fines or worse, but raising prices beyond official limits could alienate customers or attract legal trouble. Here's a quirky tidbit: some towns held bread fairs, where bakers competed to produce the finest, most perfectly shaped loaves, turning baking into a spectacle of pride and community spirit, even as bread laws lurked in the background. Historians still argue whether these market regulations helped protect consumers or simply increased bakers' stress and reduced product variety. Some suggest market oversight promoted fairness. Others say it stifled innovation and favoured established bakers. You notice the subtle social dances in the market, loyal customers waiting for their favourite baker, apprentices darting between stalls with fresh batches, and inspectors making rounds. Their presence a constant reminder of rules that couldn't be ignored. You also learn about the role of bread weavers, assistants who arranged loaves artfully on shelves or baskets to attract buyers, a skill as important as baking itself. A lesser-known fact, market disputes over bread quality or price sometimes erupted into public quarrels or even riots, reflecting how essential and contentious bread was in everyday life. You imagine the pressure on bakers to perform not just as artisans, but as savvy merchants and diplomats, managing relationships with customers, competitors, and regulators. You sense how public scrutiny in marketplaces magnified bakers' fear of bread laws, as any mistake or rumour could damage reputation and sales instantly. You also glimpse the human stories, the pride of a baker winning praise for perfect loaves, the relief of a family buying bread after a long day's work, and the tension when inspectors challenge a batch that doesn't meet standards. Marketplaces were vibrant theatres where economics, law and community intersected, and where medieval bakers' fears were both personal and public. You think about how marketplaces shaped the culture of baking, fostering competition, collaboration, and the constant negotiation between rule-following and survival. As you step away from the clamour and warmth of the market stalls, you carry with you a vivid sense of bread's central place in medieval life, where every loaf told a story of craft, commerce, and the delicate balance between order and chaos. You leave the lively marketplaces behind and step into the shadowy realm of medieval punishments for breaking bread laws, where fear of penalties loomed as large as hunger itself. The consequences for bakers who defied the rules could be severe: fines, public humiliation, or even physical punishments, making every loaf a potential legal risk. Imagine yourself in a bustling town square, where a baker stands on a wooden platform, his head shaved and his ears nailed to a pillory, holding a sign that brands him a bread cheat. The crowd murmurs and points, some sympathetic, others jeering, as the baker's shame is displayed for all to see. This spectacle serves as a grim warning to anyone tempted to fudge the rules. A mainstream fact, medieval punishments for violating bread laws range from monetary fines to public shaming methods like the pillory or stocks, and in extreme cases, temporary closure of the bakery or confiscation of goods. These measures aim to deter cheating and maintain public confidence in bread quality and fairness. You feel the heavy weight of social pressure. Bakers not only risked financial ruin, but also damage to their reputation and standing within the community. The fear of being branded dishonest was often as potent as legal penalties. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, bakers caught repeatedly cheating were forced to wear special badges or signs declaring their offences, making every trip to market a humiliating public statement. Imagine trying to sell bread with a cheater badge pinned to your tunic. Historians still argue how effective these punishments were at maintaining order. Some suggest harsh penalties kept bakers honest and consumers safe. Others think they bred resentment and secret defiance, pushing illegal baking underground. You notice that punishment was as much about maintaining social trust as about enforcing laws. Bread was essential, and ensuring everyone got fair measure was critical to preventing unrest or riots over food shortages. You also learn that the severity and type of punishment varied widely by region and period. Some towns were lenient, favouring fines, others adopted more dramatic public punishments as deterrents. A lesser-known fact, in some cases, entire baking guilds faced collective penalties if one member was caught cheating, adding a layer of peer pressure and communal responsibility to enforcement. You imagine the psychological toll on bakers, the constant anxiety of inspections, the dread of accusations, and the humiliation of public punishments, all while trying to keep ovens hot and loaves coming. You also see how these punishments affected baking culture, creating a climate of suspicion and competition, but also fostering mutual vigilance among bakers to uphold standards. You think about the role of the community as judge and jury, how neighbours, customers, and officials all participated in policing bread quality, making enforcement a collective responsibility. This fear of punishment added another layer to why medieval bakers dreaded bread laws, not just legal risks, but the potential social fallout and personal disgrace. As you walk away from the pillory and the murmuring crowd, you carry with you the sense that medieval baking was a high-stakes business, where every loaf was weighed not just in ounces but in trust, law and fear. You drift away from the harsh public punishments and into the quieter but no less fraught domain of medieval bread recipes, secret formulas and baking techniques that bakers guarded jealously, fearing that slipping up could mean penalties under bread laws. Behind every loaf lay a carefully crafted method, balancing tradition, legal limits, and the desire to please customers. Imagine standing in a dimly lit bakery kitchen, the aroma of yeast and toasted crust filling the air as a master baker kneads dough with practiced hands. This dough is no mere mix of flour and water. It's the result of generations of trial, error, and careful adaptation to changing laws and tastes. A mainstream fact: medieval bakers relied on detailed, often unwritten, recipes that governed everything from flour proportions to fermentation times and oven temperatures. Knowledge passed down orally or in rare manuscript form within guild circles. You can almost hear the whispered conversations among bakers, sharing tips on how to stretch flour, improve crumb texture, or keep bread moist without violating weight or price laws. These recipes were trade secrets, guarded fiercely to protect livelihoods. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers added unusual ingredients like crushed herbs, ground nuts, or even small amounts of resin to create distinct flavours or to disguise lower quality flour. Secret hacks that skirted regulations but delighted customers. Historians still debate how standardised medieval bread recipes really were. While some evidence suggests rigid guild controls, others point to regional and individual variations reflecting local resources and preferences. You sense the creativity behind these recipes, bakers balancing the need to meet legal requirements with the desire to innovate, making bread that was not just legal but delicious. You also learn about the role of apprenticeships in transmitting baking knowledge. Apprentices spent years mastering the craft, learning recipes, oven management, and how to navigate the risks posed by bread laws. A lesser-known fact: in some towns, bakers' guilds maintained written recipe collections, sometimes hidden away to prevent theft or misuse, almost like medieval cookbooks with a hint of espionage. You imagine the stress of perfecting a recipe that met guild standards while maximising profit, all under the looming threat of inspections and penalties. You also see how these recipes formed part of community identity. Different regions proud of their rye breads, spiced loaves, or dense country breads, each telling a story of local culture and resources. You think about how modern baking still echoes these traditions: secret family recipes, artisanal breads with unique flavours, and the tension between innovation and regulation. This intricate dance of recipes and rules adds depth to your understanding of why medieval bakers feared bread laws. They weren't just legal restrictions, but challenges to their craft and creativity. As you step back from the kneading table, the warm, yeasty scent lingering, you carry with you the knowledge that every loaf was a blend of skill, tradition, and cautious defiance, baked under the watchful eyes of law and community alike. You move beyond recipes and enter the murky politics behind medieval bread laws, where power struggles between guilds, monarchs, and townspeople brewed beneath the seemingly straightforward rules about loaves. This is a world where baking wasn't just about flour and ovens. It was a battleground for control, influence, and survival. Imagine a dim council chamber in a medieval city hall, heavy with smoke and tension. The town's magistrates and guild leaders argue heatedly over who gets to set bread prices, control grain imports, or enforce laws. Each side has its interests, fears, and ambitions, all playing out in the background of everyday baking. A mainstream fact: bread laws often reflected broader political and economic struggles. Monarchs sought to control food supplies to maintain peace and order, guilds fought to protect their members' livelihoods, and townspeople demanded affordable bread as a basic necessity. You sense the undercurrents of power, guilds lobbying for exclusive rights, kings issuing proclamations to assert authority, and merchants scheming to bypass restrictions for profit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some guilds went so far as to spy on rival bakers or report illegal activities to curry favour with officials, turning baking into a cutthroat political game. Historians still argue about how much actual power guilds held versus royal authorities in shaping bread laws. Some view guilds as protectors of quality and fairness. Others see them as monopolists stifling competition. You notice how bread laws became tools of political leverage, used to reward allies or punish opponents, and how enforcement could be inconsistent depending on who was in favour. You also learn about the role of urban revolts sparked by bread shortages or price hikes, moments when the politics of bread exploded into violence, reminding rulers of bread's vital social importance. A lesser-known fact, some medieval cities held bread parliaments, special assemblies dedicated solely to discussing grain supply and bread prices, highlighting how central baking was to civic life. You imagine the stress on bakers caught in this political crossfire, forced to comply with changing rules, pressured by guilds and watched by officials, all while trying to keep ovens fired and customers fed. You also think about the symbolic power of bread, as a staple of life, a symbol of justice and fairness, and a tool of political messaging. This political dimension reveals another reason medieval bakers feared bread laws. They were not just economic rules, but manifestations of power that could shift suddenly and unpredictably. As you leave the council chamber's smoke behind, you carry with you a deeper understanding of the tangled web of politics, power and bread, where every loaf was baked under the watchful eye of more than just the guild or inspector, but the state itself. You leave behind the political halls and slip into the sensory daily life of a medieval baker's shop, the sights, smells and sounds that shaped both the craft and the constant pressure of bread laws. It's a world alive with flour clouds, roaring ovens, and the rhythmic thud of dough being kneaded, all underscored by an ever-present undercurrent of anxiety. Imagine standing just inside a baker's shop early in the morning. The air is warm and thick with the yeasty scent of rising dough. Sunlight filters through dusty windows, catching tiny motes that dance like flour ghosts. The baker's hands work swiftly, fingers coated in white powder, pressing and folding dough in a practiced ritual that's been repeated for years. A mainstream fact, the baking process was labour-intensive and time-sensitive. Bakers started work before dawn, managing fire temperatures and fermentation times, carefully to produce loaves that met legal weight and quality standards. You can almost hear the creaking of wooden shelves as fresh bread is stacked, the clatter of wooden paddles, and the murmur of customers already lining up outside, their breath visible in the chilly morning air. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers used music or chants to keep rhythm during kneading, turning repetitive labour into a sort of meditative practice. Imagine chanting about yeast and flour to keep spirits high in the early hours. Historians still debate how much daily life in bakeries varied by region or size of the operation. Larger urban bakeries might have had dozens of employees and complex schedules, while rural bakers worked alone or with family. You notice the constant balancing act bakers performed, adjusting recipes, managing ovens fueled by wood or charcoal, and pacing production to meet demand and legal constraints. You also learn about the sensory challenges, flour dust that could choke or blind, ovens that could scorch, and the relentless heat that baked into every corner of the shop, making summer work grueling. A lesser-known fact, some bakeries kept small animals like cats or dogs to control pests attracted by grain and flour, adding to the lively but chaotic atmosphere. You imagine the camaraderie and tensions among bakers and apprentices, who shared the grueling schedule but also competed for reputation and guild favour. You also sense the mental strain, the fear of slipping up, the pressure of inspections, and the constant calculations of weight and price, all playing out beneath the comforting aroma of baking bread. This vivid glimpse into daily life helps you understand that fear of bread laws wasn't just abstract. It was woven into the very texture of the baker's day, shaping every move and decision. As you step out of the shop, the warmth and smells lingering, you carry with you a sensory memory of medieval baking, both the craft's beauty and the burdens that came with it. You follow the winding roads from bustling bakeries to the hidden world of medieval grain supply, where the journey from field to flour mill was just as fraught with fear and uncertainty as the baker's oven. Here, you confront the vital importance of grain sourcing in the whole story of bread laws, and how controlling this chain was a key reason bakers feared those laws so much. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a golden wheat field, stalks swaying in the breeze under a pale sun, far from the clatter of markets. The harvest is in progress. Farmers bent over, sickles flashing, sacks slowly filling with grain that will soon begin a long and perilous journey to the mill and eventually the bakery. A mainstream fact, medieval bread laws weren't just about baking. They regulated grain trade and milling too. Authorities often fixed grain prices, controlled who could mill, and monitored grain quality to prevent shortages and inflation that could spark unrest. You feel the significance of this supply chain. Grain was the foundation of bread, and any disruption could ripple up the chain, affecting bakers' ability to produce legal loaves. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, millers were infamous for sneaky practices like short-weighting grain sacks or adding sand to flour to stretch supply, behaviours that sometimes triggered disputes and stricter laws. Historians still argue how centralised or localised grain control really was. Some evidence points to strong royal involvement. Other sources highlight the power of local lords, guilds, or even peasants in managing grain supplies. You notice how seasonal factors, bad weather, war, or poor harvests, made grain unpredictable, adding layers of risk to baking and bread law compliance. You also learn about the role of grain storage and transport. Granaries, river barges, and cart convoys all vital but vulnerable parts of the supply chain. A lesser-known fact, grain thieves and smugglers thrived, especially during shortages or price controls, making grain security a serious concern for authorities and bakers alike. You imagine the pressure on bakers to negotiate or sometimes bend rules to get enough quality flour, knowing that shortages could mean breaking laws just to feed customers. You also see how bread laws often reflected broader economic policies aimed at stabilising grain markets, not just controlling bakers. This deep dive into grain supply explains more clearly why bakers feared bread laws. Their entire livelihood depended on a fragile, complex network that could collapse without warning. As you leave the golden fields behind, you carry with you the understanding that every loaf depended on much more than just the oven. On politics, weather, human trust, and a chain that stretched far beyond the bakery's door. You step from the wheat fields into the dimly lit world of medieval mills, where grain met the grinding stones that turned it into flour, a crucial link in the bread chain and a hotspot for tension under bread laws. Here, the miller's role wasn't just mechanical, it was political, economic, and sometimes downright dangerous. Imagine standing beside a wooden water wheel, creaking as it turns in a slow, relentless rhythm, its motion powering the massive stones grinding grain into flour. The miller, a figure both respected and distrusted, oversees the process, constantly wary of accusations from bakers, customers, and authorities. A mainstream fact, milling was often tightly controlled, with millers sometimes required to use official equipment and charge regulated fees to ensure fair flour prices and quality. Many towns mandated that grain had to be milled locally, strengthening the miller's power and their temptation to cheat. You can almost feel the gritty flour dust hanging in the air, the dampness from the water wheel, and the heavy thud of stones crushing grain, setting the rhythm of the baker's day further down the chain. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some millers were rumoured to secretly add substances to flour to increase weight or volume, such as chalk or bran, leading to disputes and inspections, which bakers dreaded as potential law traps. Historians still debate whether millers were generally honest tradespeople or clever cheats, exploiting their monopoly over grinding. Some viewed them as essential community pillars, others suspected widespread corruption. You notice how bread laws extended to milling practices, punishing millers who shorted customers or failed to meet official standards, because flour quality directly impacted bakers' ability to comply with the law. You also learn that millers often had powerful allies, like local lords or guilds, making enforcement of milling laws a politically charged affair. A lesser-known fact, in some areas, millers had to pay special fees or rents to operate, adding economic pressure that sometimes drove them to risky shortcuts. You imagine the delicate balance millers maintained between fairness and profit, cooperation and competition, lawfulness and survival. You also sense the frustration bakers felt when forced to rely on millers whose practices might compromise the entire baking process and risk bread law penalties. You think about the unseen tensions in the supply chain, how millers' actions could make or break a baker's day and livelihood, and how this fed into the broader anxiety about bread laws. This glimpse into the mill's world reveals yet another layer of why medieval bakers feared bread laws. Not only were they at the mercy of inspectors and guilds, but also of millers whose own integrity was often in question. As you leave the steady creak of the water wheel behind, you carry with you a richer picture of the complex, precarious journey from grain to loaf and the many hands and fears involved. You leave the noisy mill and enter the shadowy courtroom of medieval bread law disputes, where bakers, millers, and officials clashed in bitter debates over fines, accusations, and broken rules. This was the arena where fear turned into real consequences, and where your survival as a baker could be decided. Picture yourself in a cramped medieval court, the air thick with dust and tension. A stern magistrate listens intently as a baker pleads innocence against charges of underweight bread, while the miller stands nearby, ready to testify about flour quality. Spectators whisper, the fate of the livelihoods hanging in the balance. A mainstream fact, many towns had legal tribunals or guild courts dedicated to bread law enforcement, where disputes were settled and penalties imposed. These courts wielded real power, often backed by city guards who carried out punishments. You feel the heavy weight of justice, and sometimes injustice, hanging over bakers who faced fines, confiscation of goods, or even temporary closure if found guilty. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some cases, disputes over bread laws were settled with public bread trials, involving taste tests or weight measurements done in front of townsfolk. Imagine your bread being judged like a reality TV cooking competition, but with far more at stake. Historians still argue how fair these courts really were. Some argue they protected consumers and honest bakers. Others suggest they were tools for guilds to crush competition and maintain monopolies. You notice how these trials could drag on, exhausting bakers financially and emotionally, sometimes leading to ruin even if they were ultimately acquitted. You also learn that political influence often swayed decisions, with wealthier bakers sometimes escaping harsher penalties than poorer ones. A lesser-known fact, some towns appointed special bread inspectors, who doubled as both enforcers and expert witnesses in court, blurring lines between impartiality and vested interests. You imagine the fear bakers felt walking into courtrooms, knowing a single misstep could end their careers, and how this legal uncertainty compounded their everyday anxieties. You also sense the communal aspect of these trials, how townspeople watched closely, their own interests tied to bread quality and price, making these disputes a public spectacle. You think about how these legal battles added another layer to the medieval baker's complex relationship with bread laws, laws that were not just rules but living, breathing forces shaping their fate. As you exit the courtroom, the echo of judgments and whispered rumours following you, you carry with you the stark realisation that the law's shadow loomed large over every loaf baked, every sale made, and every breath taken. You step away from the courtroom drama and into the twilight of the medieval era, where the fear of bread laws began to shift alongside broader changes in society, technology, and economy. It's a quiet moment to reflect on how those ancient fears evolved, and why the story of medieval bakers still resonates with us today. Picture yourself watching the sunset over a medieval town, its stone streets cooling as ovens in bakeries start to wind down. The old strict laws about bread are loosening, replaced by new ideas about trade, regulation, and consumer rights. Bakers start experimenting with new techniques and ingredients, and the rigid control that once ruled their work starts to give way. A mainstream fact. By the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, many bread laws were relaxed or transformed as markets grew, and new economic theories took hold, though fears and tensions about quality and fairness remained. You can almost hear the buzz of change. New grains imported from abroad, the introduction of advanced milling technologies, and a growing merchant class eager to innovate beyond guild restrictions. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers began using exotic spices like saffron and cinnamon, turning bread into luxury items and symbolising social status, a sharp contrast to the humble loaves of earlier centuries. Historians still debate whether these changes truly eased bakers' fears or simply shifted them into new forms, especially as capitalism and industrialisation began to reshape food production centuries later. You notice how the rise of printed cookbooks and baking manuals helped spread knowledge beyond guild secrecy, empowering more people to bake and understand bread quality. You also learn that bread's cultural symbolism persisted, still representing community, sustenance, and sometimes resistance, like the bread riots that flared up even into the modern era. A lesser-known fact, some bakeries survived these transitions by blending tradition with innovation, preserving ancient recipes while embracing new techniques, showing resilience amid change. You imagine the bittersweet relief and lingering anxiety of bakers witnessing the end of strict bread laws. Their world transformed, but the legacy of fear and vigilance etched deep into their craft. You think about how this long history informs today's food regulations, artisanal baking, and even modern anxieties about food safety and fairness. As the twilight deepens, you carry with you the knowledge that medieval bakers' fear of bread laws wasn't just about law or economy. It was a human story of survival, creativity, and the struggle for dignity in a changing world. Now take a deep breath and let the warm, fragrant memory of those ancient loaves soothe you as you prepare to rest. Now, as the story gently fades, imagine the warm glow of a hearth, the soft crackle of embers settling into silence. The journey you've taken through flour-dusted bakeries, crowded markets, and dusty courts is quieting down like the last whispers of a day well spent. The fears of medieval bakers, the weight of laws and loaves, dissolve softly into the calm of night. Rest assured, those ancient struggles remind us that behind every simple loaf lies centuries of human hope, resilience, and craft. The fear that gripped bakers was not just about rules, but about survival, dignity, and the desire to feed a community. And though the laws have changed, that spirit still needs its way into our kitchens today. Let your mind wander to the smell of fresh bread, warm, comforting, and alive with history. Feel the steady rhythm of kneading, the gentle rise of dough, and the golden crust that forms under watchful hands. It's a simple pleasure, yes, but one steeped in stories of courage and adaptation. As your eyes grow heavy, know that these stories connect us across time. The medieval baker's fear of bread laws might seem distant, but their care, their craft, and their resilience echo in every bite you take. So breathe deeply, let the past settle like soft flour on a wooden board, and drift into sleep with the calm assurance that, like bread itself, life is a process. Sometimes messy, sometimes unpredictable, but always nourishing. Sweet dreams, and may your tomorrow be as warm and satisfying as a fresh-baked loaf.